Forget everything you think you know about medieval battles. This isn't the polished choreographed sword fights from Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones. There were no gleaming armor suits, no heroic one-on-one duels, and definitely no dramatic slow-motion moments where heroes emerge victorious against impossible odds. Real medieval combat was loud, filthy, brutal, and absolutely terrifying. Most soldiers weren't trained knights with years of preparation. They were terrified farmers who'd been handed a rusty spear 2 days earlier and told to march toward their death. In this video, we're diving deep into the raw, chaotic, and often horrifying reality of what medieval warfare actually looked like. From suffocating in your own armor to dying slowly from infected wounds weeks after the battle ended, this is what combat truly meant in the Middle Ages. And I'm warning you now, it's nothing like what Hollywood has taught you to expect. Let's start by destroying the most persistent myth about medieval warfare, the image of the fully armored knight with a gleaming sword. This romantic vision represents maybe 1% of the people who actually fought in medieval battles. The reality? Most soldiers were completely unprepared, poorly equipped, and had no business being on a battlefield. The majority of men who fought during the Middle Ages weren't professional warriors. They were farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and peasants who were conscripted, often by force, into military service. When your local lord decided to go to war, you didn't get a choice. You dropped your plow, grabbed whatever weapon you could find, and marched off to die for someone else's political ambitions. Training? What training? While movies show months of preparation and weapons practice, the reality was that most conscripted soldiers received little to no instruction. You might get a few hours of basic spear work if you were lucky. More often, the training consisted of hold the pointy end toward the enemy and try not to die. Historical records from the 100 Years' War show that entire battalions were formed from men who had never held a weapon until the day before battle. Now let's talk about equipment. Forget the shining plate armor you see in movies that was custom made for the wealthy elite and cost more than a peasant's house. Most soldiers wore a gambeson, which was basically a thick, padded jacket stuffed with cloth, horsehair, or whatever material was available. It looked terrible, smelled worse, and weighed you down, but it was better than nothing. These gambesons were hot, heavy, and absorbed every drop of sweat, rain, and blood that came their way. Imagine wearing a thick winter coat in summer while running for your life. That's what fighting in a gambeson felt like. But here's the thing, they actually worked reasonably well against cuts and blunt impacts. The problem was that they made you slow, clumsy, and prone to overheating. Helmets were more common than body armor, but they came with their own problems. A basic iron cap might protect your skull, but it also cut your vision down to almost nothing. You could only see what was directly in front of you through a narrow slit. Peripheral vision, the ability to hear commands over the noise of battle, nearly impossible. Many soldiers died not because they were outfought, but because they simply couldn't see the spear coming from the side. And here's where movies get it completely wrong. Swords were rare. Extremely rare. Owning a sword was like owning a luxury car today. Only the wealthy could afford them. Most common soldiers fought with spears, axes, or clubs. Spears were popular because they were cheap to make and didn't require much skill to use effectively. Point the sharp end at the enemy and thrust. That's it. Many soldiers brought tools from home that were modified for war. Farming axes became battle axes. Hammers used for construction became war hammers. Even sharpened farming tools like sickles and pitchforks found their way onto battlefields. These weren't ideal weapons, but they were often surprisingly effective, and more importantly, they were what people actually had access to. The wealthy knights with their plate armor and quality swords, they were the exception, not the rule. And even they faced problems that movies never show. Full plate armor could weigh over 60 pounds and was incredibly expensive to maintain. It needed constant cleaning to prevent rust, regular repairs from battle damage, and skilled armorers to fit it properly. One badly fitted piece could leave a gap that would get you killed. Now let's destroy another Hollywood myth. The idea that medieval battles took place on convenient flat open fields where armies could line up in perfect formations. In reality, medieval battlefields were environmental nightmares that made survival even more difficult. Most battles weren't fought on carefully chosen ground. When two armies met, they fought wherever they happened to encounter each other. Muddy fields, rocky hillsides, dense forests, or marshy ground near rivers. Commanders rarely had the luxury of picking ideal terrain. The most common battlefield condition was mud. Deep, sticky, dangerous mud that could trap soldiers and turn a simple march into a death sentence. In Northern Europe, where rain was frequent, battlefields regularly turned into swamps overnight. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 is the perfect example. Historical accounts described French knights sinking into mud up to their knees, completely unable to move effectively. Picture this. You're wearing 40-50 pounds of armor and equipment, and you're trying to walk through mud that's grabbing at your feet with every step. You can't see clearly because of your helmet. You can't hear commands over the noise, and you're already exhausted before the fighting even begins. Now imagine trying to fight for your life in those conditions. The mud wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Soldiers who fell down often couldn't get back up. The weight of their armor combined with the suction of the mud meant that falling over was essentially a death sentence. You'd either suffocate in the mud, be trampled by your own allies, or lie helpless while enemies finished you off. Visibility on medieval battlefields was terrible. Your helmet limited your vision to a narrow field of view directly in front of you. Dust, mud, and smoke from fires reduced visibility even further. In many battles, soldiers couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction once the fighting started. This led to one of the most tragic aspects of medieval warfare: friendly fire. When you can't see clearly and everyone looks similar, covered in mud and blood, you end up attacking your own allies. Historical records from battles like Towton show that significant numbers of casualties were caused by soldiers accidentally killing their own comrade. Communication was nearly impossible once battle began. Officers could shout orders, but no one could hear them over the clash of metal, the screams of wounded men, and the general chaos of combat. Armies relied on horn signals and banner movements, but these were easily missed or misinterpreted in the confusion. The psychological environment was just as brutal as the physical one. The smells alone were overwhelming. Sweat, blood, urine, feces, and the metallic scent of iron and steel. Add in the sounds, men screaming in pain, the crash of weapons, the wet sounds of blades cutting flesh, and you have a sensory experience that would break most modern people within minutes. Weather made everything worse. Rain turned battlefields into slippery mud pits. Hot sun made armor unbearably hot and led to dehydration and heat stroke. Cold weather made weapons slippery and fingers numb. There was no good weather for medieval combat. Every condition brought its own unique problem. Here's where we completely shatter the Hollywood fantasy of medieval combat. Forget elegant sword duels, forget heroic charges, and forget any notion of honor or fair play. Medieval battle was chaos, pure terrifying chaos where survival was more about luck than skill. When two battle lines collided, organized formations collapsed within seconds. What followed wasn't strategic combat. It was a desperate, crowded brawl where men fought for their lives in conditions that were barely human. The first shock was how cramped everything was. Soldiers were packed shoulder to shoulder, pressed so tightly together that there was barely room to move, let alone swing a weapon properly. Those dramatic sword strokes you see in movies, completely impossible. There simply wasn't. Instead, combat became a series of short, brutal movements, quick stabs with daggers, overhead strikes with hammers, or grappling matches where men tried to wrestle each other to the ground. Soldiers often held their swords by the blade and used the pommel as a hammer, a technique called half-swording, that gave better control in tight quarters. The fighting was incredibly close and personal. You could smell your opponent's breath, see the fear in his eyes, and feel his blood splashing on your face when you struck him.
There was no distance, no time to think, and no opportunity for the kind of tactical thinking that movies portray.
Weapons were used very differently than you'd expect. Swords were often grabbed by the blade and used as clubs. Spears became short stabbing weapons when the lines closed. Axes and maces were devastating, because they didn't need to penetrate armor. They could crush bones and cause internal injuries through even the best protection. The ground became treacherous within minutes. Blood, mud, and bodies created a slippery surface where one wrong step meant death. Soldiers who fell were usually finished off immediately. either by enemies or by being trampled by their own allies who couldn't stop moving forward. Here's something movies never show. Most combat wasn't one-on-one. When you spotted an enemy, you and several allies would attack him simultaneously. There was no concept of fair fighting or honor. In the middle of a life-or-death struggle, if 5 men could surround and kill one enemy quickly, that's what happened. Exhaustion set in terrifyingly fast. Imagine doing intense physical exercise while wearing heavy clothing and a helmet that restricts your breathing. Within minutes, most soldiers were gasping for air, drenched in sweat, and barely able to lift their weapons. Many collapsed from exhaustion before they were ever wounded. The noise was overwhelming and disorienting. Metal clashing against metal, men screaming orders that no one could hear, the wet sounds of weapons striking flesh, and the constant dying of hundreds of people fighting desperately for their lives. Many soldiers reported that the noise alone was enough to drive them to panic. Fear was constant and overwhelming. Even experienced soldiers admitted to being terrified during battle. Some froze completely, unable to move or react. Others panicked and ran, often trampling their own allies in their desperation to escape. The psychological pressure was so intense that many soldiers lost control of their bodily functions. Something historical accounts mention but movies conveniently ignore. Everything you think you know about battlefield deaths in medieval times is probably wrong. Movies show clean sword strikes and dramatic death scenes, but the reality was far more brutal and often much slower than Hollywood would have you believe. Most soldiers didn't die from sword wounds. In fact, blades were often the least effective weapons on a medieval battlefield. Why? Because armor actually worked. Chainmail could stop most slashing attacks, and even basic padding was surprisingly effective against cut. The real killers were blunt force weapons, maces, warhammers, and heavy axes that crushed rather than cut. A blow from a mace to the head might not penetrate a helmet, but it could cause massive brain trauma. The force would transfer through the metal, causing concussions, brain hemorrhages, and skull fractures. Soldiers often appeared fine immediately after such hits, then collapsed hours later from internal injuries they didn't even know they had. Blunt force trauma to the torso was equally devastating. A heavy blow could break ribs, puncture lungs, or cause internal bleeding without leaving obvious external wounds. Many soldiers walked away from battles thinking they were fine, only to die days later from internal injury. Here's something truly grim. Archaeological evidence from medieval battle sites shows that many soldiers died from wounds to the back of the head and neck. This tells us that a huge number of battlefield deaths occurred when soldiers were already down, being finished off by enemy. Once you fell in medieval combat, you were essentially dead, either from being stabbed while helpless or from being trampled by the crowd of fighting men. Drowning was more common than you'd think. Some soldiers fell face down in mud and couldn't get back up due to the weight of their armor. Others were pushed into rivers or marshes during retreats. The Battle of the Herrings in 1429 saw dozens of French soldiers drown in a shallow stream because they couldn't right themselves after falling. But here's the truly horrifying part. For every soldier who died in battle, several more died in the days and weeks that followed from infected wounds. Medieval medicine was primitive, and there were no antibiotics. Even minor cuts could become infected and turn deadly. Field surgery was brutal and unsanitary. Surgeons, often just barbers with some medical training, worked with dirty tools that were used on multiple patients without cleaning. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, using only alcohol to dull the pain. Many soldiers died from shock during these procedures. Infection was the real killer. Dirty weapons, contaminated clothing, and poor wound care meant that bacteria had countless opportunities to enter the bloodstream. A soldier who survived a spear thrust to the leg might seem fine for a few days, then develop a fever as infection set in. Without modern medicine, there was nothing to stop the progression from infection to sepsis to death. Tetanus was another major killer that movies never mention. Rusty weapons and dirty conditions made tetanus infections common after battles. Soldiers would develop painful muscle spasms and eventual paralysis, a horrible way to die that could take weeks. Heat stroke and dehydration killed soldiers even when no enemies were near. Fighting in armor during hot weather was incredibly dangerous. Some soldiers collapsed and died from overheating, especially during summer campaigns in southern Europe. Perhaps most tragically, many soldiers died from simple accidents that would be survivable today. A broken leg from falling off a horse, a cut that became infected, or internal injuries from blunt force trauma. All of these were essentially death sentences in an era without modern medical care. Surviving a medieval battle didn't mean the nightmare was over. In many ways it was just beginning. The aftermath of medieval combat was a scene of horror that would be difficult to show in any modern film, filled with suffering that continued long after the last sword was lowered. Immediately after battle, the field was covered with a mixture of the dead, the dying, and the severely wounded. There was no organized medical corps, no paramedics, and no systematic way to help the injured. If you were wounded, your survival depended entirely on whether a fellow soldier had the strength and inclination to drag you to safety. The sounds after battle were almost worse than during the fighting itself. Instead of the clash of weapons, there were the moans and cries of wounded men, some calling for water, others for their mothers, and many simply whimpering in pain. Some soldiers lay quietly, knowing that drawing attention might bring enemies looking to finish them off rather than friends offering help. Medical care, when it existed at all, was brutal. Field surgeons worked quickly and without precision. Their primary tools were saws for amputation, hot irons for cauterization, and alcohol for both cleaning wounds and deadening pain. There were no anesthetics beyond getting the patient drunk or having them bite down on leather. Amputation was common and often necessary. A badly mangled arm or leg meant infection and death, so cutting off the limb was sometimes the only option. These procedures were performed in unsanitary conditions, with tools that weren't sterilized between patients. Many soldiers who survived their battle wounds died from infections introduced during their treatment. But before medical care could even begin, there was the matter of finding the wounded among the dead. Battlefields were often searched by survivors looking for friends, but also by scavengers seeking to loot the bodies. Looting wasn't considered disrespectful, it was practical survival. Weapons, armor, boots, and any valuables were taken from the fallen, regardless of which side they had fought for. A good sword could feed a peasant family for months. Armor could be repaired and sold. Even shoes were valuable enough to strip from corpses. This scavenging began immediately after fighting stopped and continued for days. Many wounded soldiers were inadvertently killed by looters who mistook them for dead, or who decided that finishing them off was easier than checking if they were still alive. The disposal of the dead was another nightmare entirely. High-ranking nobles might be identified and given proper burial, but common soldiers were typically buried in mass graves or simply left where they fell. At Towton in 1461, so many men died that bodies were still being discovered during plowing operations centuries later. In some cases, especially after battles fought far from populated areas, bodies were simply abandoned to scavengers and decay. Wild animals, ravens, and other creatures fed on the remains. Chroniclers wrote about battlefields that stank for miles around and remained hazardous to cross for months after the fighting ended. For those who did survive and receive some form of treatment, the journey home was often as dangerous as the battle itself. Wounded soldiers had to travel on foot or in crude carts over rough roads, often without adequate food or shelter. Many died en route from their injuries, exposure, or disease. The psychological state of survivors was devastating, though it wasn't understood at the time. Men returned home changed, traumatized by what they had seen and done. Some couldn't readjust to normal life. Others drank heavily to forget. Many simply wandered from place to place, unable to settle down or form normal relationships. Communities often struggled to reintegrate these traumatized veterans. A man who had been a peaceful farmer before the war might return as someone prone to violence, nightmares, and unpredictable behavior. Families sometimes reported that their loved ones came back as strangers, fundamentally changed by their experiences. This is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of medieval warfare, the devastating psychological impact on those who survived. While people in the Middle Ages didn't have terms like PTSD or combat trauma, the historical record is full of descriptions that clearly show soldiers suffering from what we would now recognize as severe psychological damage. Medieval chroniclers wrote about warriors who returned from battle, changed in spirit, or possessed by demons. What they were actually describing were the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Survivors exhibited behavior that their communities found disturbing and inexplicable: sudden violent outbursts, constant vigilance, inability to sleep, and reactions to loud noises that seemed far out of proportion to the actual threat. Nightmares were incredibly common among veterans. Historical accounts describe soldiers waking up screaming, reliving battles in their sleep, or acting out combat movements while unconscious. Some would wake up and attack family members, mistaking them for enemy. These night terrors could continue for years or even decades after the original trauma. Many survivors developed what we would now call hypervigilance, an inability to relax or feel safe. They would constantly scan their surroundings for threats, react violently to unexpected sounds or movements, and struggle to trust anyone around them. This made it nearly impossible for them to readjust to peaceful civilian life. The randomness of survival was particularly traumatic. On the battlefield, death seemed arbitrary. A man standing next to you could be killed instantly while you escaped without a scratch. This randomness shattered many soldiers' understanding of justice, fairness, or divine protection. Some became convinced they were cursed or marked for death, living in constant fear that their survival was only temporary. Survivor's guilt was another common reaction. Many veterans were haunted by the question of why they lived when better men died. Some had survived by playing dead among corpses, hiding under the bodies of fallen enemies, or abandoning wounded comrades to save themselves. These survival tactics, while effective, left psychological scars that never healed. Medieval society offered virtually no support for psychological trauma. There was no understanding that the mind could be wounded like the body, and no treatments for what we now recognize as mental health issues. A traumatized soldier might be seen as possessed, cursed, or simply weak. Some joined religious orders, seeking peace or forgiveness for what they had done in battle. Others turned to alcohol as their only form of self-medication. The concept of honor that surrounded medieval warfare made psychological trauma even worse. Soldiers were expected to be brave, stoic, and unaffected by violence. Admitting to fear, nightmares, or emotional distress was seen as cowardly and shameful. This meant that many veterans suffered in silence, unable to seek help or even talk about their experience. Some veterans became unable to function in normal society. They might react violently to minor disputes, be unable to work alongside others, or struggle with the mundane concerns of daily life after experiencing the ultimate stakes of life and death combat. Medieval records describe former soldiers who became outlaws, hermits, or wanderers, unable to settle into peaceful communities. The impact on families was devastating. Wives often found themselves married to strangers who no longer resembled the men who had left for war. Children grew up with fathers who were prone to unpredictable rages, long silences, or behavior that seemed incomprehensible. Many families were torn apart by the psychological aftermath of medieval warfare. Perhaps most tragically, many veterans were driven to seek out more combat as a way of coping with their trauma. They became mercenaries or joined new military campaigns, not because they loved fighting, but because the battlefield was the only place where their heightened state of alertness and readiness for violence felt normal. This created a cycle where traumatized soldiers sought out more traumatic experiences, unable to find peace in civilian life. So there you have it, the truth about medieval battles that Hollywood will never show you. No heroic duels, no gleaming armor, no honorable last stand, just terrified farmers dying in the mud, succumbing to infected wounds weeks later, and those lucky enough to survive carrying psychological scars for the rest of their lives. The next time you watch a medieval movie with its dramatic sword fights and noble warriors, remember what combat was really like: cramped, chaotic, and utterly brutal. Remember the soldiers who fought not for glory but because they had no choice, equipped with farming tools and protected by padded jackets, dying not from clean blade strikes but from blunt force trauma and infection. The archaeological evidence supports every grim detail we've covered today. Mass graves filled with young men's bones, skulls showing evidence of multiple blunt force impacts, and weapons that tell the story of desperate close-quarters violence far removed from any notion of chivalric combat. This is the reality that medieval people lived with, the knowledge that warfare meant suffering, trauma and death, on a scale that most of us can't imagine. The romantic image of medieval combat isn't just wrong, it's a disservice to the memory of those who endured these experiences and somehow found the strength to survive them. The next time someone talks about the good old days of medieval warfare, you'll know the truth. There was nothing good about it at all.